Hi there, and welcome to the Grief and Rebirth podcast. I'm your host, author and trauma survivor Irene Weinberg, here to encourage you wherever you are in your healing journey. In each episode, I chat with incredible grief and trauma specialists, healers, mediums, and celebs, as well as remarkable people who have inspiring healing stories to share. If you're looking for a podcast that's both uplifting and inspiring, you've found it. Let us help you find your joy in life.
Hi, everyone. I hope this finds each of you so very well. I'm speaking to you from my studio in West Orange, New Jersey. Absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to interview Sandy Kirkham, who will be speaking to us from Cincinnati, Ohio. Sandy's award-winning book is titled, Let Me Pray Upon You, Breaking Free from a Minister's Sexual Abuse, which details her account of how a charismatic youth minister preyed upon her, betrayed her, left her broken with a shattered faith, and brought about the ultimate shame of being blamed and forced from the church she loved. Despite a happy and successful life as a wife, mother, and friend, Sandy successfully concealed her abuse for 27 years until a trigger forced her to face the truth. Her journey of healing began when she confronted the minister during her quest for justice and closure. Sandy has spoken before the Ohio Senate, a Maryland court, on a local TV show in Boston, in a documentary, and she has worked with survivors of clergy abuse. She is now a volunteer for a ministry called the Hope of Survivors, and she serves on the board of the Council of Child Abuse. I'm looking forward to talking with Sandy about her journey from an innocent 16-year-old victim to a survivor and advocate, the healing that began for her when she confronted her sexual predator and the church elders who condoned his heinous behavior. And I have to say, I know I'm breaking script right now, but I'm more mad at them than I'm mad at him. I was like, whoa, when I read that, oh, you jerky men, awful. How she was able to eventually forgive both herself and her abuser, which is amazing, and more, for what is a riveting, important story about trauma, grief, healing, and rebirth after dreadful clergy abuse. Hey, Sandy.
Hi.
A warm welcome.
Thank
Truly
you. It's good to be here.
To Grief and Rebirth podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's begin with this question, so everyone can kind of get to know you and where you were coming from with all of this. Mm-hmm. So could you please tell us about your childhood and what made you a vulnerable target for your youth minister, who is a charismatic wolf in sheep's clothing, to say the least?
I think the biggest factor was the fact that my parents divorced when I was 8 years old, and we moved immediately into my stepfather's house. And it was just a traumatic moment in my life, and it turned everything upside down in my world. And so I think my insecurities about who I was and what life was about started then. I was the oldest of 5 children, so there was a lot of chaos and hubbub in the house. And so the church for me provided a very warm and welcoming place. My parents didn't attend church, but I was asked by my neighbor to go with her, and I absolutely loved everything about that church when I went. As a young child, I went to church camp, vacation Bible school. I eventually would teach Sunday school, and I would sing in the choir. It was just a place that I absolutely loved. And I think this pastor saw not only my vulnerabilities, but my complete trust in the church that allowed him to see me as someone as easy prey.
Wow. And that church gave you the support and the love and the care and the connection that you were missing at home.
Yes,
right? It filled in all those blanks. So here he came.
Right.
You'll pardon the expression. So in what ways did he target you, groom you, and prey upon you when you were an innocent 16-year-old girl?
Well, he obviously first tapped into the fact that I was a leader in the church. And I remember the very, very first time I met him. He said hello to me. He took my hand and he wouldn't let go of it as he talked. And I kind of remember thinking, that's kind of weird. He's holding on to my hand. I don't know why he's doing that. But, I just dismissed it. I was 16 years old and he's my pastor. but then it started beginning with the church and getting me more involved. And he started taking me to places like hospital visits, and he would find time to spend time with me to read the Bible. I babysat for his family. His wife worked evenings, so that actually gave him the perfect opportunity to spend time with me. And like I said, we would sit and read the Bible. We talk about church, and none of that seemed out of line to me because he was my pastor. And so as I talk about the grooming process, it is establishing an emotional connection with the victim to get them to become not only dependent upon their abuser, because I liked the attention. I felt special in the church because of all the attention he was giving, but it is also a way that the victim becomes not only dependent, but she starts to accept behavior in this individual that she wouldn't normally accept in another person because he was my pastor. The first time he kissed me was in my home after a youth group meeting. He waited for everyone to leave. I was standing there. He was telling me how wonderful I was, how great I was in the church, how much he appreciated me helping in his ministry. And it was to no one's surprise that he tapped into me because I was already a leader in the church. But he just all of a sudden bent down and he kissed me. And it was sort of this quick, innocent kiss. So I couldn't really figure out what he was.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Exactly.
Testing.
Exactly what it was. And because it was like this quick, innocent kiss, it was easy for him to dismiss it if I questioned him. But it also made it easier for me to dismiss it because I'm thinking, well, this is my pastor. He wouldn't be doing anything he shouldn't be doing. So that's the example of me accepting something in the behavior of this person because he's my pastor that I wouldn't have accepted from my neighbor down the street. And when I babysat for him, he would wait before he would take me home. We'd spend hours together while his wife was at work. And I thought about that later. If this had been my 30-year-old neighbor down the street, and wanted to sit all evening and talk to me, I would have gone home to my mom and said, okay, this is weird. He doesn't take me home after the kids are in bed, and he wants to sit and talk to me. Why would I, as a 16-year-old, want to talk to a 30-year-old man? I wouldn't normally, but my pastor was different. And again, because I didn't see my dad very often, my parents were divorced, I didn't see him much, I looked at him as a father figure. And so I craved those times with him. And then it slowly started where the touching started, the kissing became more passionate till eventually he had sex with me.
Wow. Once he had that control over you, and now we're hearing how he manipulated and betrayed you, but he manipulated and betrayed you even more. And he even left you with your shattered faith. And then he brought about the ultimate shame when you were banned and forced from the church you loved. So a talented guy, he perpetrated all of this on you and you took the fall. What was that about?
Well,
how long were you involved with him?
5 years.
Wow.
It went from the time I was 16 till I was 21.
Wow.
And I think it's also important you've mentioned it. He was very charismatic. I mean, the church loved him. People looked up to him. They treated him like a rock star. Mm-hmm. He was really like a cult leader. And so it was to no one's surprise, at least, that when he was caught, and that's what happened, he was caught. Two people in the church became suspicious.
How did they, about the two of you?
Yes. And they followed him one night and found us in a hotel room. And so once he was caught, they rallied around him because he was this wonderful person. They looked at me as this young teenage girl who trapped him. And I was told that because of my behavior, I was to leave the church. And this was after they had given him a going away party with lavish gifts and money and sent him to the next church. Now, I think this will come to no surprise to you and to some of your listeners. This was not the first time he had been accused of sexual misconduct. Shortly after he arrived at our church, a young woman from his first church came forward, accused him of inappropriate behavior. He didn't deny it. He said he was sorry. He begged for forgiveness. The elders decided to forgive him, and no information was given to the congregation. My parents weren't aware of anything about his past. And within 6 months of that accusation, he was kissing me in my hallway. So, when I was told that I was to leave the church, I was devastated. This was my whole life. And I had believed what I'd been taught, that we could be forgiven for our sins that I thought I had committed. And for him to be forgiven and then for me to take the fall and the blame only reinforced really what those 5 years had taught me with him, that I wasn't worthy of love and that I deserved this and that no one would love me like he could. And the only reason he can still love me is that no one else would, because I was no longer a virgin. All of that was told to me over and over
He
and
would
over
tell
again.
these things to you?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
He took your virginity away from you, and now he's telling you you're not worthy because
that's the
you're not a virgin.
gaslighting. That's the gaslighting, where they will tell you things over and over again to a point where you no longer trust your own judgment, to a point where you feel like they're in control and they know what they're saying and they're doing. And so to question that only is met with, you don't know what you're talking about, or you misunderstood what I said, or that's not true.
You're crazy making.
They're crazy making. And that's exactly what it was. And again, in the beginning, the other thing I think I need to point out too is once he had sex with me, then it was, you can't ever tell anyone. And if you do, no one's going to believe you and you're going to be blamed. Now, let me say, at 16, 17 years old, I know sex is wrong outside of marriage, and it's certainly wrong with a married man with 2 children who's my pastor. So for me, it was about shame of people finding this out about me opposed to telling on him. So he kept me in that trap that way to threaten me. He became violent at one point. He hit me. So all of those things added to my sense of, I have no way out of this.
You poor thing. And you couldn't go to your mother and you couldn't go to your father.
No. And even though there were people around me that I probably could have told, I tell people, just because there's a way out of the forest doesn't mean you can see that way out. And so I truly did not feel like I had any choice but to stay with this person. And I always thought, I will never get married. I'll never have children. This will only be over when he says it's over. And thankfully, 2 people did become suspicious and his actions were discovered. But then the end result was I was blamed.
You were the one who took the fall for that.
I was blamed.
That's terrible. So we've talked about what love bombing is, because he bombed you with love and told you you're wonderful. Then he groomed you. Mm-hmm. Then he gaslit you to make you crazy. And then he manipulated you.
Correct.
So when did you begin to understand those terms to allow you to begin your healing process?
Not till 27 years later.
Wow.
Once I was kicked out of the church, and that's the term I use. I wasn't asked to leave.
That's terrible.
I was kicked out of the church.
You're a kid.
And I will also say that as devastating as his abuse was, the reaction of that church probably had more of a traumatic effect on me the rest of my life than the actual abuse.
I'm telling you, when I read your book, I was madder at the church elders than I was. Right. I mean, he was a sick puppy, but what was their story? I mean, really?
They enabled it. It. And this was after they knew about him the first time. He does it again the second time with me. And what do? They move him to the next church, where, to no one's surprise, he commits sexual misconduct again. Of course he does. That's what's going to happen. So, for me, the healing didn't really begin till after 27 years. And that healing and those terms came to light for me when I finally, let me just talk about what the trigger was. It forced me to force myself to learn about my past. And
okay, but I want to ask you, before you talk about that, can I also ask, because everybody's wondering, how the heck did you get away from him?
Well, once he moved away physically, he moved to another church. That didn't mean he didn't continue to call me, which he did. He continued to write. He expected me to come down and visit him in his new church in Tennessee. But being away from him gave me a little more strength to be able to say no at times. And at one point, he insisted that I come see him. I was going to have a date with my future husband, and I started crying. And I said, please don't ask me to come. I can't come this weekend. I promise I'll come next weekend. I mean, I don't know that I can even describe to you the control he had over me. There was a fear. My mind was in a point that whatever he said I needed to do, I would do. And in my book,
you were brainwashed.
I was absolutely. And in my book, I talk about some very horrific things that he told me to do, that I acquiesced and did. And for the longest time, I was shameful. I felt guilty about that. But once my healing began, I understood that this was an abusive relationship that I had no control over, and what was done to me, not just what was happened to me. But I got away from him because I was able to be physically away from him. And then when I met my husband, I saw what a good relationship could be. And I didn't know where this relationship with my husband would go when we were dating, but it opened my eyes that there was love out there that I did never have the past 5 years.
That was you got an angel. That's all I can say. You got an angel. We'll talk about that later. But hey, I had one of those. I know a good man when I read about him.
Yeah.
So tell us about that trigger 27 years later that forced you to face this truth. And I especially want everyone to hear your husband, the angel's reaction when he learned about the degrading abuse you'd hidden from him for 27 years. Wow.
Yeah. So you have to also understand, I never saw this relationship as abusive. I saw it as I'd had an affair with a married man who was my pastor. So I never saw it as abuse. I saw myself as a contributor to this relationship and that I agreed to it. So that was a lot of guilt and shame that I carried. And my friends never knew. My husband didn't know, because think about this. How bad do you have to be kicked out of a church? And that was certainly something I didn't want anyone to know. But the trigger that forced me to look at my past, I was driving to one of my daughter's golf tournaments, and it was in Tennessee. And I happened to pass the exit sign to the church that he had moved to after leaving our church. And it just sent me into a tailspin. I was sobbing. I couldn't control myself driving. I had to pull off to the side of the road. And I sat and I sobbed and I sobbed and I sobbed. And for the first time, I felt something inside of me that said, he did something awful to you and you didn't deserve it. And I couldn't put the word abuse to it at that point, but I knew that there was something wrong and that it wasn't my fault. And from that point, I began studying and Googling everything I could about clergy sexual abuse. And that's when I learned the terms grooming and gaslighting and love bombing. And it opened my eyes, because I could look back and say, that's what he was doing to me. He didn't care for me. He didn't love me like he said. He was actually doing these things to take advantage of me and to keep me under his control.
I mean, he did not know what love was. He's
No.
obviously a very damaged person.
He's a narcissistic individual. He abused his wife. Fortunately, she eventually divorced him. But yes, he doesn't have the capacity for empathy or for concern. And really, once he got me to that having sex with me, he totally changed. He was no longer this caring individual. He was very controlling and manipulative. And I saw a totally different person. And yet he would have sex with me on a Saturday night and stand in the pulpit on a Sunday morning and preach about the sanctity of marriage. So, for me,
Wow.
I couldn't, the only way I could, let's say, figure out what was going on in my life was to accept it, because it was too hard for me to try.
You were a kid. You were a kid.
And to reconcile this person that everyone loved, who was saying he was a man of God, and who truly, on one hand, you would look at him and think he was a wonderful person. How did I reconcile that with the man who I saw? And so at some point, it was just a matter of I just accepted this relationship.
Well, I really want everyone to hear about your husband's reaction when you actually told him. And I also want them to hear about the people who supported you and actually believed you, believed in you, and supported you through your healing journey. Because when you're faced with such abuse, I don't think you can face it alone, but you have to really discern the safe people who can be there with you. And God bless them for doing that. So you want to tell us about your angel and your friends who...
So let me start with my friends. I had a good core group of 5-6 women that were my very good friends, but I only told my very best friend first, because I have to tell you, the words never tell and you'll be blamed never left my consciousness, never left that. So when I went to tell her, I saw, for 15, 20, 30 minutes, I don't know how long, I couldn't get the words out because I was so afraid that once I said that, what was going to happen? I had spent almost a lifetime protecting that secret, and now I was going to let it go. She was wonderful. She was kind. She was angry at him, which validated in my mind, yes, he was wrong and he shouldn't have done what he did to me. And then I slowly told 2 or 3 other of my friends, because as you pointed out, You have to have that trust in your friends. And for so long, I was so afraid of people finding out my secret that now I was going to let it go. I had to be sure. And I did tell my story, but I told it in bits and pieces, because I would tell a piece to see, okay, let's see how they react to this. What if I tell them he asked me to do this and I did it? What are they going to say? And all along the way, I got nothing but love and support. And that is so important to healing. It's just, you need that support. I eventually then told my husband, and I was most afraid of telling him, not because I didn't think he would care and understand, but those doubts just kept creeping into my mind. And I had to calm myself to say, this is the man who loves me and he's going to support me. But I thought, well, is he going to wonder why I kept the secret from him?
And weren't you, there was a part of you that maybe was afraid of losing him ultimately?
Well, absolutely.
You get so frightened and you're so brainwashed that
right,
with the secret.
And the trauma lasts forever. So the trauma is still talking to me. The trauma and his voice is still there saying, you shouldn't tell, you didn't tell. So when I feared that he would wonder why I couldn't trust him to have told him sooner. Would he see me different sexually? Would that play into it? All of those fears were for naught. He could not have been any more kinder. He was angry at what was done to me. He supported me. And one of the best things he said to me. So at that point, when I told him, I said to him, I think I want to find my abuser and confront him. And I think he was concerned about that and he was rightfully so, because one of his points that he made to me was, Sandy, he's not going to care. He's going to tell and say what he needs to do to keep his job, because he's still a minister at this point. And I think he was worried that my expectations of what would happen at this meeting would be too high and that I would be disappointed. But for me, I just felt like I needed to look him in the eye and say to him, you had no right to do what you did to me.
It was more for you than anything, just for your catharsis, your healing.
And I tell victims, it's not something everyone can or should do. Not everyone has the opportunity because their abuser has died. But for me, it was what I needed to do. And one of the best advice my husband gave to me was this: Sandy, no one knows what you have gone through. No one understands your pain and trauma. And you need to do what you think is best for your own healing. And so when he gave me that,
he gave you permission.
He opened it up for me. It was like, okay, he's going to support me no matter what I say or do. And I may screw it up and I may be sorry I confronted this guy, but he's going to have my back regardless. And that was,
wonderful. Your husband's also an attorney, right? So that probably gave you a little bit of
courage.
Also courage. Yeah.
And the other thing I will say that helped me to face him, and believe me, it was not easy to do. It was horrible to do. However, I knew that he couldn't deny it. So many victims will go back to their abuser or tell someone, and the abuser says, hey, she misunderstood that, or I don't know what she's talking about. He couldn't deny it. And so that was also
why helpful. Did you feel he couldn't deny it?
Because he was caught. He was caught.
Oh, because the two of you had been caught.
Yeah, he'd been caught. It was made public to part of the congregation. I also knew about his second incident in the next church where they kicked him out finally. So yeah, I knew that he couldn't deny it. Now, I have to tell you, I was worried that I would walk into that room and be 16 all over again. It didn't happen. I was.
Were you there with your husband?
My husband was with me. I took my friend who was at the church at the time, just in case he was going to try to spin anything. And then I also took my counselor. And so that four of us were in the room with him. And he did what I thought might happen. He made excuses. He said that he had an alcoholic father. He said that he'd been in counseling. He'd been identified as a sexual addict, which at one point I'm thinking, why does a church hire a sexual addict with a history? But he's still a minister.
Well, we'll get to talking about how those elders reacted. Why do they do it? Because they're in denial themselves.
Yes.
And maybe they somehow identify with, they think he's cool or wonderful or right. So I wanted to ask you about the impact spiritually when abuse occurs within a church And is there a difference in perspective when the abuser is Catholic or non-Catholic? Because you hear a lot about this in the Catholic Church also.
I've worked with a lot of Catholic victims. I don't know that there's much of a difference. The only thing I would say is that many of the Catholic victims are small boys, and that affects them in a way that they feel like they might be homosexual because they've had sex with this man. So I think they have a little bit of extra baggage. But as far as the trauma goes, and probably in the Catholic Church, the priest is looked up to and is looked as God more so than in the Protestant churches. So that probably adds to their trauma, because now they feel like they're somehow having sex with God, and that messes up your mind big time. But let me just say, this happens in every denomination, every faith community. And so people who will say to me, well, I'm not Catholic and I don't have to worry about this. I said, well, I wasn't Catholic and I should have worried about it, and I didn't. And my mother should have worried about it.
Right.
We trust our spiritual leaders. That's what we do. So that's the how I kind of think the Catholics and the Protestants are different.
I tell people in all situations, you really have to be discerning. I mean, I've come across people in the spiritual world who ended up not being such righteous people. They talk the talk, but they don't necessarily walk the talk. I've experienced that.
Yes.
So you have to really be discerning about who you're dealing with.
And those abusers and those perpetrators use that cloak of faith as a weapon. I mean, they know that they're automatically trusted over another individual, and that our defenses are down around them, and we don't question their behavior. So I tell people, if you see a priest, a rabbi, or a pastor doing something that you find a little unsavory, or maybe it's a little questionable, if it's not behavior you would accept in another individual, then don't accept it just because they wear a robe. That behavior needs to be questioned. You don't allow it to pass just because they're a clergyman.
And this is an important interview because I think a lot of people are going, really people, help people not be quite so naive in those situations. So this is a big one. How were you able to eventually forgive yourself and your abuser? Because people talk about forgiveness, and especially that we're talking about in a church setting, forgiveness. Well, I mean, I've learned that forgiveness is more about letting go than forgetting. But how did that work out for you?
Well, let me say it took me about 2 years. So it wasn't something that came easy to me. I began to forgive myself when I educated myself, when I understood that I was sexually abused and this man in position of power had control over me, and that I didn't have the control to stop him. I was targeted for my vulnerabilities, and he then preyed upon me with my vulnerabilities by pretending to help me. And so once I understood that, it took me a long time, because many victims will tell you they continually go back into their mind. Why didn't I say no? Why didn't I do this? I should have said this. No, there's nothing you could have done or should have done that would have changed the situation you were in, because it wasn't a fair fight you were in. You were targeted and you were preyed upon. You were a weaker prey to a predator. So that was how I finally was able to let go of the guilt and shame that I'd carried for 27 years. In forgiving him, I found that for 27 years, I carried guilt and shame. After I confronted him, I was carrying anger and hatred. And that wasn't working for me, because I was spending so much of my time being angry at this man for what he had done and how he had changed my life and what he had taken from me. And finally, I came to the conclusion, as you just stated, I had to let go of it because it was eating away at me. I would wake up in the morning and find myself, after a nightmare of having a nightmare about him, just so angry. And I wasted the day. And I thought to myself one day, I've been angry all day at this man. I can't do anything about it. I'll bet you he hasn't given me 1 ounce of a thought, not one. So it was like I needed to let go of him, because as long as I was angry at him and having this hatred, he was still a part of my life. He was in my life every single day that I thought about him in the anger. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't believe there should be consequences for their behavior. That's not what forgiveness means. It doesn't mean I remain silent. He called me, I don't know, a few months after I confronted him, angry at me because I was speaking out about this abuse. He said, well, you said you would try to forgive me. That's not what forgiveness is. There are consequences, and the victim has a right to heal. And my healing meant that I needed to speak about my abuse.
What did you say to him when he said that to you? Now that you're the adult listening to the same BS and you're educated, what was your response?
I just said to him, I said, that has nothing to do with whether I forgive you or not. And I said to him, if you didn't want me to speak like this about you, you should have behaved differently. This is the result of how you behaved and what you did to me. If there's to be any issues on this, it's because you created it, not me. So, and I didn't have a very long conversation with him. I was actually just shocked that he called me, which again shows me that he's not repentant or deserves forgiveness.
Just manipulative.
He's calling me, telling me I'm emotionally blackmailing him, which I thought was rich considering all the emotional blackmail he went for 5 years over me. These men don't change. If he'd been truly repentant, the first time he got caught with that first girl in his first church, he would have said, you know what, I have a problem and I don't belong in the ministry. That's what a repentant person does. The alcoholic knows he can't go back to the bar. He knows he's weak in that area. So I didn't believe him when he said he was sorry. And I really felt I wanted him to say he was sorry for the pain he caused me. And he couldn't articulate that. He was sorry that it happened. He was sorry that he was the person he was that caused him to do this, but he never understood the pain he caused and what he had done to my spiritual life.
Because it was all about him. He didn't have that capacity.
Exactly.
So let's talk about, let me pray upon you, breaking free from a minister's sexual abuse. And I want to tell everyone who's listening, it's a really worthwhile book for you to read. It had me spellbound, Sandy. And what would you like everyone to know? Because it's a really important story. And you talk so more about your story than we're touching on here. But is there anything you'd like people to know who are considering getting the book for themselves or sharing it in their house of worship or whatever?
Well, I'm very proud of the book, and I do think it is a book that should probably be in every church library, because my purpose in writing the book was twofold. One, I wanted people to understand how clergy sexual abuse works and how manipulative a person in a position of spirituality can be, and how easy it is for a person to fall prey to them. So I talk about that a lot, but I also wrote it because I wanted victims to understand that healing is possible and how my journey may help them in their own journey. Each of us is going to take a different path to healing, but many of our paths are the same. We have to learn to forgive ourselves. We have to understand that we didn't deserve what was done to us, which is what I believed for so many years. And we need to understand and believe that any guilt and shame that we carry belongs squarely on our abusers. It's not ours to carry. And then we need to tell our secret. We can't carry around the secret of abuse. And I know that's hard to do because I spent 27 years protecting a secret. So this is coming from someone who knows how hard it is to tell. But you need to find a trusted friend, a counselor, anyone that you know would accept and believe your truth of abuse. And if you've been abused in the church, I would highly suggest that you choose someone outside of the church to tell. There may be someone in the church that might respond in the right way, but I wouldn't take that chance, because what also happens with these men in clergy positions, they also groom and manipulate the entire congregation and get them on their side. So there is this tendency to support the offending pastor, priest, or rabbi, opposed to supporting the victim.
When you confronted some of the elders, they were not at all supportive of you, even after all these years had gone by, and you confronted the ones who empowered him, and yes, they didn't care.
They basically, I was told when I confronted his elders, I sent 11 letters to each of his current elders, And not one responded back.
Wow.
Not one. They just, ignore her and hopefully she'll go away. I then went to his denominational leaders. Again, I was shut down. Now, I will say my church, my former church that kicked me out of the church, I requested a meeting of them. Now, none of the elders were there at the time, but that church needed to take accountability for what was done to me 27 years earlier. And so they were very gracious in giving me a meeting, and every one of them apologized for what was done to me and offered me any kind of support that I needed. So they did the right thing, albeit 27 years later. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that and how much it did aid in my healing.
Sure. I'm glad to hear that for you.
So there are, there are good men in church positions, and there are good churches out there, but that doesn't mean that we aren't vigilant, knowing that there are some characters out there who do evil things. They're, like you said, and they are wolves in sheep's clothing. Right. And they needed to be treated as wolves. Yeah,
you're right. So now you flip the page, you're doing your healing, and now you have transformed to become an advocate. Mm-hmm. And you're an advocate for a ministry called the Hope of Survivors. And you serve on the board of the Council of Child Abuse. And so tell us about that and other ways that you're helping to help people in these situations. And thank goodness for that.
Yes. The Hope of Survivors ministry is, you can go to their website. It's just the Hope of Survivors. And they help mostly adult women who have been abused by clergy, but they help, but there is, as I've said, abuse is abuse. And so, a lot of same techniques are used on men, they're used on children, they're used on adults. It doesn't matter. So
does something pop up if someone says clergy abuse?
Yes.
Go about that will pop up for them.
Yes. But if you just, type in the Hope of Survivors, it'll pop up. It's also on my website. If they go to my website, I've got a lot of information about books that they can read, websites that are available. I really encourage victims who are hesitant to talk to anyone. You can find a lot of websites where you can be anonymous and share your story. So as a beginning. And there's a lot of good help out there, but the Hope of Survivors is one. And again, it's on my website and it's in the back of my book as well. And then Council on Child Abuse is an organization that I am on the board of that helps go into the schools and teach about sexual abuse and bullying, because kids who are bullied, they are prime for sexual abuse later. And so we try to help children teach about why we shouldn't bully and how to stop bullying, and then also how to prevent sexual abuse and understand what good touch, bad touch is. And so that's what Council on Child Abuse does.
And I'm going to slip into your wisdom for a minute, because that is an issue a lot of people deal with. How do we prevent bullying? How do you talk to the kid who is bullying and the kid who is being bullied? How do you advise in that situation? Because that's a very common problem in today's world.
It is. And we have trained professionals who go in and talk to these children. But I would also say that when a child is being the one who is doing the bullying, that's a red flag that child has some issues in his life and needs to be treated, not so much as a big old bully that it needs to be reprimanded, but to dig deeper to find out why he is so insecure that he has the need to bully. And the programs that we provide are good for both ends of that, so that, we hope that it reaches the child who's doing the bullying and the child who's being bullied. And we need people in the schools and families to recognize that, when a kid says he called me a name, well, names don't hurt you. Yes, they do.
Yes,
they do hurt. And if you're bullied constantly, then you start to believe you're fat, or that you're dumb, or that you're not pretty enough, or whatever the bullying is the result of. And so it's important that we stop that as soon as we can, because as I said earlier, those are the kids who are going to be looked at as easy prey by a predator. Because
go ahead, I'm sorry.
They're looking for someone who's going to be kind to them. They're going to be looking for someone who's going to treat them in a way that they want to be treated. They look for the person who's going to say, no, you're very pretty, you're very smart. And they're going to latch on to that predator.
What is a good thing to say to a kid who's bullying? other kids to get them to stop that behavior? Do you have anything?
That's a long process of, I don't think it's just one thing. And again, I'm on the board, so I don't do all the training per se. I think kindness, though, has to be a part of it. And I know it is a part of it when our trainers work with these kids, because again, they are the ones that have issues in their life as well. I'll have to think about that one. That's a good question.
Let me know when you come up with that.
I will.
I would love to put that on even Facebook or whatever. Because a lot of people, they talk about trying to help the child being bullied, but how do you stop the kid who's doing the bullying?
Yes.
And he thinks he's being very cool. He's part of a group or whatever they're doing,
Yeah.
And he doesn't think he has a problem.
No. And I know that that's part of the program, but I'll talk to one of the trainers and I will get back to you on that, because I think that is it. You're right. It's important because they are going to continue doing that and hurt a lot of children along the way.
That's right. They're going to continue to do it unless you can get them to stop.
And the other thing, that bullying, while it may start as name calling, when they get to be older and teenagers, that bullying is going to be more physical.
Right. And how about if it ends up in the workforce and you've got a boss who's a bully or whatever that is?
Yes.
So I think it would be really good for people to know how to stop that.
I agree. Totally.
Yeah. And I think you have a discount promo for your incredible book.
I do. It's a 20% off. It's on my website. I don't have the code right here, but if you go to my website,
we'll put it on. We'll attach it.
Just go to my website.
Okay. Sandy Kirkham.com, I'm sure, but whatever.
Well, it's Sandy Phillips Kirkham.com. It's my maiden name in there. And you just go to that website.
And we'll put that on there. We'll put all that information. And from you, of all people, what is your message about the importance of healing that you'd like to share with our podcast audience?
The first thing is, I would say, it is not your fault. It is absolutely not your fault. This was something that didn't just happen. It was done to you purposely, and you had no control over it. And you need to understand and believe that. Secondly, I would say you need to tell someone. And again, I'll repeat, I know how difficult that is. Find a support group, whether it's online, an individual, a counselor. You need a support group. You cannot do this alone. I also would say you need to face your pain. It's not easy to heal. Healing is a difficult process, but it's worth it. And it's not, for me, healing I was looking for an end. It isn't an end. Our trauma, our abuse will always be a part of our lives, but it doesn't have to define your life. It doesn't define your life. You are not who your abuser said you were. You are not the result of your abuse. You need to live the life that you deserve to live, and you can do that. So hope and healing is possible.
It's beautiful.
It's
and
possible.
There can be joy again, right?
Absolutely.
What is your advice about finding joy again? Because some people feel if they've had the trauma and pain, they can't let themselves.
First of all, by telling your truth, you are freeing yourself. And when you're free, you can then find joy. When you're trapped in a lie, when you're trapped in your abuse, when you're trapped in a secret, you can't have joy in your life, because you are now, for me, I was spending all my energy trying to keep this secret and trying to make myself feel better about myself. So telling your truth will free you enough to find that joy, and you deserve it. That's the other thing we need to remind ourselves. Our abusers take our self-esteem and put it to a point where we don't believe we're worthy of happiness. When I was happily married with 2 great kids, I always felt like I didn't deserve it. And we do deserve it, and you deserve it. And so that's what I would say to victims of, whether it's clergy abuse or any other kind of abuse, any abuse. And be kind to yourself. You've had a traumatic event in your life that has changed you. Be kind to yourself.
Wrap yourself in your own hug,
yes.
Let alone looking for it from others. And isn't it wonderful? Because I'm sure the joy that you feel now is so much deeper and more beautiful every moment of it than it was before, because it's clean. You cleared out the debris.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Sandy, you state that the abuser will always be a part of his victim's life, but he doesn't have to define his victim's life. Indeed, you've shown tremendous strength and courage by speaking before the Ohio Senate, a Maryland court, on a local TV show in Boston, and a documentary. You've worked with survivors, and now you're award-winning. Let Me Pray Upon You. Breaking Free from a Minister's Sexual Abuse is your potent platform from which you can help even more victims of clergy abuse. Thank you from my heart for your strength and your courage in sharing your riveting journey from trauma and grief to profound healing and rebirth. And here's a loving reminder, everyone, that you can see the show notes and all Grief and Rebirth podcast episodes on ireneweinberg.com. And make sure to follow us and like us on social at Irene S. Weinberg on Instagram, Facebook, and wherever you get your social media. And as I like to say, to be continued, many blessings. Bye for now. And thank you so much, Sandy.
Thank you.
I'm so happy for you that your life turned out and you're helping so many people the way you are.
Thank you.